Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now, I'm Philip Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, and I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer, NATO planner, and commentator across the globe on all things geopolitics, defence, security, counterterrorism, cyber, and anything else people ask me to comment on. A number of videos for you to watch this week. Of course, I recommend all of them because all of the interviews that we managed to get done this week have been absolutely fantastic and will give you real insights as to what's going on. But a few to highlight, and they're related to what I want to show you first of all, because this is the famous meeting of the coalition of the willing leaders, President Zelensky and President Trump and his team in the White House.
There'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
And this is a part, I think. It's not a part for the war and to defend us. It also will be a part for security guarantees, to strengthen our army, to rearm Ukrainian army. This is very, very important. And it depends how much money we need to rearm. For example, the question of air defense, we spoke about it with President Trump, and I'm happy that we have now bilateral decisions and we work on it with production, American production. Nobody in Europe has so many air defense like Patriots, for example. We need it very much, and this is also about defending.
Really feel that we can, I think, with the right approach this afternoon, make real progress, particularly on the security guarantees, and your indication of security guarantees, of some sort of Article 5 style guarantees, fits with what we've been doing with the Coalition of the Willing, which we started some months ago, bringing countries together and showing that we were prepared to step up to the plate when it came to security. With you coming alongside, the US alongside what we've already developed, I think we could take a really important step forward today. A historic step, actually, could come out of this meeting in terms of security for Ukraine and security in Europe.
Is there a date for you to meet with President Putin of Russia?
Sorry, what? Yeah, what?
Is there a date for you to meet with President Putin?
The date?
Yes.
No, we don't have any date.
No
We don't have any date. We just confirmed after this productive meeting with President and then with all our colleagues, with the partners, we confirmed that we are ready for a trilateral meeting. And if Russia proposed to President of the United States bilateral, and then we will see the result of bilateral, and then it can be the trilateral. So I said always, so Ukraine will never stop on the way to peace, and we are ready for any kind of formats, but on the level of leaders.
Yeah, well, today's meeting was good and constructive, and there was a real sense of unity between the European leaders that were there and President Trump and President Zelensky. And we had two material outcomes. The first, on the question of security guarantees, was the agreement that the coalition of willing countries, that's 30 countries already working together on security guarantees, will now work with the US on those guarantees, coordinating, and we have already commissioned our teams to do the detailed further work on that. That's really important for security in Ukraine, for security in Europe, and for security in the United Kingdom. The other material outcome was the agreement that will now be a bilateral agreement between President Putin and President Zelensky.
So what are the key things about this? Well, it's unprecedented that you've got so many European leaders alongside leaders from the EU and Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, all together in the White House to show their solidarity with President Zelensky. And their presence gave that solidarity as Zelensky sat down with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, and there wasn't an ambush this time. In fact, Zelensky even managed to joke with the journalist who had asked him the question that started the ambush about his suit whenever he was there beforehand. And the joke then went back onto the journalist. But we see lots of pressing of flesh, and there's questions over what was actually achieved at that meeting. I think the most significant thing that was achieved is that Donald Trump didn't try and force any land swap on the Ukrainians. And that, I think, is a significant achievement. talk of trilaterals and bilaterals between Zelensky and Putin, and trilaterals between Zelensky, Putin, and Trump. Whether those will turn into anything, my personal view is they are merely thoughts that are out there, and we're unlikely to see anything. But the Russians, as ever, respond to the comments that come out from that. And this is the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov's response.
We are seeing an increasingly clear understanding by our partners in the US of the need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, rather than trying to support those who throw out slogans about an immediate ceasefire and at the same time say that a ceasefire will not mean a stop of pumping Ukraine with weapons. This is precisely the statement that French President Macron made not long ago, and it is good that the absolutely adventurous position, a confrontational position, a position in support of continuing the war, does not find understanding in the current US administration. As for the reports that Great Britain, France and Germany want to develop collective security guarantees for Ukraine, we are in favour of these guarantees being truly reliable. And we have a very good example, which, by the way, refers to the initiative of the Ukrainian side itself, as it was in Istanbul in April 2022, when the Ukrainian negotiating team proposed to the basic principles of an agreement on ending hostilities and ensuring a sustainable settlement. We cannot agree with the fact that it is now proposed to resolve collective security issues without the Russian Federation. This will not work. We have already explained more than once that Russia does not overstate its interests, but we will ensure our legitimate interests firmly and harshly. And I am sure that in the West, and above all the United States, they understand perfectly well that seriously discussing security issues without the Russian Federation is a utopia, a road to nowhere. Before we evaluate the EU's diplomatic steps to resolve the Ukrainian crisis, we need to see them. So far, we have only seen a fairly aggressive escalation of the situation, rather clumsy and, in general, unethical attempts to change the position of the Trump administration and the US president personally, as we saw when the Europeans accompanied Mr. Zelensky to Washington on Monday this week. We did not hear any constructive ideas from the Europeans there. As for the US president and his team, yes, we see that they have indeed been engaged in diplomacy in the Ukrainian direction for several weeks, practically since they came to the White House. Kaja Kallas, by the way, who is considered the chief diplomat in the European Union, the high representative for all sorts of foreign affairs, she said after the Washington meeting that the European Union will not trust any agreements with the Russian Federation. The European Union will therefore continue to support the armed forces of Ukraine, and the European Union will promote new sanctions against Russia regardless of the agreements that it does not trust. Well, this is not diplomacy. This is already a degradation of foreign policy methods, which, in fact, the European Union boils down exclusively to sanctions. Following a telephone conversation with President Trump the day before yesterday, our president made a proposal not only to continue these negotiations, but also to think about raising the level of heads of delegations. And this fits in with our proposal, which I just mentioned, that within the framework of this process, a separate block would be devoted to examining the political aspects of the settlement, along with the military and humanitarian ones. It is clear that the reaction of the Ukrainian side does not depend on us. But since this idea was received positively by President Trump, we expect he will convey it and explain it to the Kyiv representatives, and we will receive a reaction.
And Lavrov is talking about any peacekeeping forces or any forces inside Ukraine, and turns around and says that there'll be no peacekeeping forces and there'll be no forces from NATO contributing countries inside Ukraine. That is a red line for the Russians. This is no change on what Lavrov and Putin and Peskov and others have come out with. And we'd expect Lavrov to do that. After Alaska, Putin thought he had Trump under control again. And for a period of time, I think the rest of us thought that had happened. That's why there was so much support from world leaders going in with Zelensky to the Oval Office meeting. And it seems, as ever, Donald Trump has listened to the last briefing he's been given, and it wasn't the Russians this time. So we're still on a secure path. So of the interviews that we have this week, I've got three I want to point you at. The first one is George Barros from the Institute of the Study of War. And this was him and I talking about the Russian attack that came in to the north of Pokrovsk, where they managed to advance 10 to 15 kilometers very rapidly before the Ukrainians managed to blunt that attack.
In the last week and a half, just to recap what happened, Russian forces, and I'll take a little bit of time to characterize them in a moment, they conducted a tactical infiltration task. They found a weak spot in the Ukrainian line, and they managed to penetrate the Ukrainian line by about 15 to 20 kilometers. And then they managed to extend their salient. And what happened was, I think there was a really hyperbolic overreaction to this, particularly on the social media space, saying that the Russians have achieved a breakthrough, that there's a big risk of there being an operational level breakthrough. And this was all happening on like the Monday ahead of Putin's summit with President Donald Trump in Alaska last Friday. So look, the Russian forces, they were moving in small units. I mean, these were at most a battalion's worth of combat power, morcelized into squad or squad plus elements of between 10 people at the small end to maybe up to 50 people at largest, dismounted infantry, sometimes using motorcycles, and they also used special anti-thermal blankets to camouflage from thermal imagers to sneak in. And so this was never a mechanized assault, the breaking of the line, that sort of thing. But what it did was, when all the open source intelligence mappers were trying to draw the new Russian frontline trace to accommodate this new protrusion, it created this really unwieldy shape that looked quite alarming on paper, but without the additional context about, hey, what the nature of this force is, how small it is, the fact that it was a very narrow and long penetration without really the width necessary to have a stable flank. And make it very difficult to sustain. People sort of panicked. So, and I think, not completely and rightfully so. It was a very rapid development, and it was very scary at the time. But what the Ukrainians did is within a few days, they redeployed elements of the Azov Corps to do a blocking mission. The Azov Corps, as far as we are aware, they've successfully blocked it, and then they began counterattacks at the tactical level to capture and destroy about that battalion's worth of Russian combat power. Russians have reported in their own sourcing that because the salient is so narrow, they've had a hard time resupplying it. They've had a hard time getting in and out. There's been a certain amount of geolocated footage that we've seen of the Ukrainians taking prisoners of war. Ukrainian war journals are reporting about how they're trying to now, apparently, the Ukrainians are trying to cut off the salient by attacking it at the root. And so yesterday we made some new map changes that reflect some of that reporting. And it appears that the situation has stabilized at the cost of course, having pulled units from the line, lateral redeployments from elsewhere to cover that front. So that potentially provides a little bit of liability in other parts of the line. But for now, that particular sector is stabilized. And Putin, I think, did not get what he was hoping for in Alaska on Friday. I think he was hoping for a knee-jerk reaction from the international media, particularly English language media, saying, Putin and Trump are meeting in Alaska on the foreground of there being a breakthrough in Ukraine's eastern region after months of stalemated war. That was not the characterization of the war. I'm very glad that was the case. It's unclear to me if the Russian general staff specifically bespokely tailored an operation designed to achieve that effect. They very well might have. I don't know. Or if it was just circumstances that they managed to achieve that tactical mission during the time ahead of the meeting, but Putin was denied that. So that was quite a good thing, and it was an interesting episode in the war.
Yeah, but the timing was perfect for Vladimir Putin with his visit to sit down with Donald Trump. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But a number of other things came out of that struck me. Yes, it was a Russian battalion / regimental sized grouping that went in, using new methods of crossing the battlefield. From the lessons that they've learned in other parts of the battlefield. But is this the first time that we've seen a coordinated attack with that sort of level of organization? And if it is, that suggests to me that they've got some capable commanders who can think that through. But it seems that they overextended themselves by going too far forward. They hadn't thought that they were going to exploit as much, so there wasn't a follow-on force to punch through the hole that they created and then start to develop that out into a bridgehead and develop it further. So it was a lower level tactic that had a surprising success rather than being coordinated by higher level formation as part of a bigger plan. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't have the Russian, operational plans to know for a fact. My suspicion is that it was more likely the latter. the tactics are not new. They've been using dismounted infantry and infiltration tactics. They've been using space blankets before. They've used motorcycles before. Now, the echelon's interesting. Did they deliberately deploy a battalion or a regiment minus in order to do this specifically as a task organized force? Or did it just so happen that they had tactical successes with some small squad-sized units, and then the local commander decided, well, we seem to have found a soft spot here in the line, just send some more, and then it ended up being roughly a battalion's worth of combat power. I actually don't know, but we're not sure. But what I do know is that the Russians, they fight like water. They act like a bunch of water you throw on a bunch of rocks, which is when they hit a hard spot, they try to bypass, they try to find these tactical nooks and crannies where they can make ins, and then when they find the ins, they then reinforce it. And so it seems that those forces that got to this tactical penetration near Dobropilia, they found a soft spot, that's for sure. They found an undermanned part of the line, and they reinforced it. And they might have gone too far, too fast, overextended their lines, sort of the classic blunder of 2022 for the Russians, but on a much smaller scale. And made themselves vulnerable to a counterattack.
And George and I go and discuss the details of it and how the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defences and why they advanced so quickly. And we had a bit of a debate about understanding how the Russians would have task organised their forces to do this, and then why it wasn't successful. The timing was interesting, we agreed, because it was just before Putin's visit to Alaska, where it would have allowed Putin to suggest that he was in a position to take large parts of the Donbass that he didn't currently hold back relatively quickly. But the Ukrainians, with their new core designed forces, managed to move a brigade-level combat capability to stop the Russians' advances, to fix them in place, and then to cut them off from the rest of the Russian positions, isolate them, and are starting to defeat them. I couldn't recommend that interview more highly. Our next clip is with an old friend of Frontline, Professor Scott Lucas. And Scott is talking about how after the visit of Zelensky to the White House, actually Zelensky came out on top, and how important it was for the European leaders, the coalition of the willing leaders, to be there, and how that turned what had been seemingly something that would have been very difficult, if not a failure, for the West after Putin's visit to Alaska, where it seemed that Donald Trump was going to try and force Ukraine to give up some territory. It turned around into nothing like that happening at all. And Scott, as ever, in the way he has a very in-depth understanding of this, explains why this has been a success for Zelensky. And I couldn't agree with him more. Again, highly recommend that you watch the whole of that interview.
Huge win for Zelensky in Europe. Cannot, I think, underestimate this. Now, we'll need a few days to see how this plays out, but let me lay this out for you. Going into this today, we've got Friday where Trump's basically like a yo-yo. So who's pulling the string, right? And Putin's pulling the string last Friday because the Europeans and Zelensky have been bolstering Trump. Ceasefire, sanctions. Putin has that meeting in Alaska to push back the sanctions threat, succeeds. To get the narrative off of ceasefire, succeeds. And he gets the bonus that the Americans put up this Putin proposal, which is not only do I get part of the east and south of Ukraine, you got to give me all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in eastern Ukraine. You got to give me territory I don't even have at this point. And so, some of us looking at the weekend going, geez, Trump has folded. We watched him fold to Putin, but is he really folded to that extent? Credit to Zelensky and the Europeans. And this, story I can tell you actually goes back, going back to February. And I'll explain why if you wish. They kept their eye on the ball. They kept their eye on the strings, which is how do we pull the strings when we see Trump on Monday? Now, part of that is going to be in the sense of presentation. And that is, and as other people have noted, it's not just Zelensky who's there. It's 7 European leaders, European Commission President von der Leyen, NATO head Rutte, 5 national leaders. They do that to show unity, but also it prevents Zelensky from being isolated like he was at the notorious February 28th meeting with the J.D. Vance ambush. Now, that has worked a treat. In fact, it's actually worked better than I expected. The original schedule, Louis, was we have the presser, then we have Trump and Zelensky on a one-on-one meeting, and then he meets the Europeans. It looks like what has played out here is they've gone straight from the Zelensky-Trump presser to the Europeans and Zelensky in with Trump. So there's no chance for any bad actors. I'm looking at you, Steve Witkoff, possibly J.D. Vance, spoiling it in that meeting between. So when we have this presser, the win on presentation is, despite certain pro-Trump journalists trying to bait him, Zelensky doesn't take the bait. He dresses real nice. The whole, made up stuff about the suit, and he's wearing a suit this time. And Zelensky skillfully points it out. Look at me, my nice suit. I'm learning from you. Look at me. He flatters Trump at every opportunity. Key moment. He gives Trump a letter from Elena Zelenska, the First Lady, to Melania Trump to establish that personal bond. And that follows on, by the way. That's really important because Melania Trump is starting to take more of an interest in what's happening. She's been working on Donald about how mean Vladimir Putin is. And she sent a letter to Putin in Alaska saying, you should let these Ukrainian children go that you've deported. So Zelensky's working that angle. And then even though Trump is going off the rails, quite often he's incoherent. It's a me thing. He's slagging off the media. He's slagging off the Biden administration. In one bizarre moment, he's slagging off mail-in voting. Zelensky never interjects. He never jumps in, and he never makes the mistake he made in February of saying diplomacy doesn't work with Putin. Never makes that mistake. So not only is it important who spoke, who didn't speak. The Trump envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and J.D. Vance just sits there. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was off to the side looking like he wanted to be the bully in the playground, scowling. But, I think Pete was just concentrating on tough guy pose and wasn't quite sure what was going on. Big win. And it took me from a few minutes to get to the reveal. For all the rambling and incoherence of Trump, several times he repeated that the United States will join Europe potentially in security guarantees for Ukraine. The Trump administration has never done that. They have stood against that. Remember, they cut off military aid earlier this year. Remember, J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference said, we're out of here. Bye, kids. Going home. It's up to you, Europe. Now, Trump is saying, we will protect you. Now, that may not mean American troops. And that's where the media will get, is it American troops? Is it American troops? It doesn't have to mean American troops. It can mean European troops, but it means American intelligence sharing, American logistics, American engineering, American transport, American cooperation, and American weapons, albeit by selling them to NATO, who then transfers to Ukraine. If this is the arrangement that is confirmed coming out of these meetings, it puts Vladimir Putin in a very difficult position. Actually, there's a second takeaway that puts him in a difficult position. In addition to the security guarantees, remember this, Vladimir Zelensky, I look forward to a trilateral meeting with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Trump, I think a trilateral meeting would be great. And we know it would because it's more publicity for Donald. But who doesn't want a trilateral meeting? Vladimir Putin does not recognize Vladimir Zelensky as the president of Ukraine. He doesn't recognize the Zelensky government. So now Putin has got to face a prospect of, does he reject an arrangement which includes security guarantees for Ukraine? And does he reject that trilateral meeting, which makes him look like the bad guy? Even though we're no longer talking about ceasefire, we're talking about, quote, peace deal. And if he rejects it, does Trump blame Zelensky? On the evidence of today, no.
And our third interview is with Lord Peter Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, a former diplomat, and he has got a real understanding of what it is like from a diplomat's perspective with everything that's going on. But him and I sit and discuss the idea of peacekeepers going in. And of course, there's been a lot of talk in the British newspapers about British troops going on the ground, and I think talk from French newspapers and in the German press of French and German troops going on the ground should there be any peace agreement. I think we're of the mind that we're a long way off there being a peace agreement, and it's unlikely there is to be something that will result on troops on the ground. But if there are troops on the ground, it will not be in a peacekeeping or a peace enforcement role. It will be in a supporting the Ukrainian forces, whether that be through training or other means, logistical support, and potential for a no-fly zone to go in. But Peter Ricketts' understanding of the geopolitical circumstances around everything is insightful. I couldn't recommend that interview again more highly.
Trump has a very odd kind of admiration, almost hero worship of this man Putin, and always has had. And I mean, just to pinch ourselves and remember that Putin is an indicted indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. In most of our countries, he would have to have been arrested if he'd landed on our soil. Of course, America hasn't ratified the International Criminal Court, but nonetheless, to treat him with that degree of red carpet respect as if he was a state visitor, I think, was just out of line with the position every other Western country takes. And yes, the fact that there wasn't a press conference, actually, there was a rather constrained little exchange of prepared comments at the podiums and then no questions, quite unlike the treatment given to Zelensky. In one case, there clearly it was a bit of democratic accountability going on, the other, not at all. Trump played Putin's game of not allowing awkward press questions to be put to Putin. So I think Putin came out of this feeling it had been a fantastic piece of validation for a man who is a pariah in most Western capitals. And I think he also managed to slip in a number of his propaganda lines, as we were talking about, ceasefire, no, we'll go for a long peace deal. Of course, a peace negotiation of the kind that Putin is looking for would take years, probably. He's got all kinds of ideas to throw into it, including restrictions on what NATO can do in Eastern Europe. And Trump alarmingly easily bought into that and the idea of land swaps. So, yeah, and this was Putin's great moment. And the key thing now is, I think, to try and hold Trump to the slightly more balanced position that they seem to have got him to in the sessions on Monday.
So do you think Putin is now emboldened by this, and therefore it's going to push him further away from wanting to get some form of peace settlement because he thinks he's got control?
Yeah, I think he's decided that Trump never follows through on these threats. There have been endless threats that, unless you do this in 50 days and unless you do this in 10 days, dire things will happen. 100% sanctions will be slapped on you. All kinds of horrors will happen. None of it has. And I think Putin is now quite confident that he can always string Trump along, avoid any action against Russia. Russia is about the only country in the world which Trump hasn't decided to sanction in one way or the other. And as I said, this is a very odd sort of hold that Putin has over Trump intellectually. And so, no, I think he feels he's completely free of the risk of that, emboldened, as you say. I think he can go on stringing along the idea that, yes, well, there will be peace talks, but, they're all very complicated. Meanwhile, he continues to grind forward on the battlefield, which is the most important thing to him. And so, of course, it's important that we all get together in Europe and talk about security arrangements and so on for the post-ceasefire period. But I don't think we're any nearer a ceasefire than we were a week ago.
Yeah, but the battlefield is interesting. This week, UK Defence Intelligence, in fact, just before Keir Starmer flew across the States for the summit with Zelensky, released a post that said that calculating how long it would take the Russians to capture the rest of the disputed Donbass on the rates of advance that they'd had so far would take another 4.4 years and 1.9 million people. And that's just the Russian casualties. I'm assuming Vladimir Putin's team will have done a similar calculation, which is why they were trying to get this Donald Trump to sign up to this land swap, or just give me all of the Donbass, and then we'll be happy.
I'm sure. I mean, they'd much prefer to be gifted it than to have to conquer it with those kind of scale of losses. Yes, absolutely. It's also why I thought it was very clever of the European leaders to show Donald Trump a map indicating that for Ukraine to give away the remaining parts of the Donbass that the Russians haven't occupied would be about the equivalent of the US handing over Florida. And that's said to have, had an impact on Trump. Well, it might. I think those sort of visuals and the bringing it home way of making arguments probably play rather well for him. So yes, I mean, it would be a colossal victory for the Russians to be accorded the rest of the Donbass in a peace settlement where they hadn't won it in war, and it would be political suicide for Zelensky and his government.
Yes, visualization when giving something to politicians or senior generals is always something. The best that I ever had to give from an intelligence perspective to a politician, I'll not embarrass him by naming him, in an operation in Iraq, when I was trying to describe the complexity of what was going on, I referred back to the life of Brian and the People's Palestinian Front, the Palestinian and everything else that was there. And he said, "Philip, thank you, I've got it."
I've got it. Absolutely. Well, I think there was an I've got it moment there in the Oval Office around that map, for as long as it lasts in Trump's imagination. But he's moved by personal stories, clearly. The sight of a starving child in Gaza led to him picking up the phone and berating Netanyahu. I mean, again, of course, his attention span is so minimal that leaders can ride it out. But he can be moved, and I think to give him some credit, he is sincere in wanting to get the fighting stopped. He's just massively, massively underestimated all the way through the complexities of that and the determination of both sides after 3.5 years of war.
Yeah, but clearly European leaders were concerned. How unprecedented was it to get the number of European leaders that we saw flying off to Washington to support President Zelensky in his meeting in the Oval Office, to stop there being another ambush and something that would lead to even greater difficulties to try and unpick it if Donald Trump had made some decisions about land swaps and other things. Is this something that is easily put together? Is it the norm? If you'd heard about it in your diplomatic days, would you have gone, yeah, that's not a problem, or would you have gone, oh my goodness, how are we going to deal with this?
Well, the latter. I think it's completely unprecedented. I can't think of any occasion where you've had leaders of that seniority jumping on planes, literally deciding over a weekend that they're going to be there on Monday. Perhaps it helped a bit. It was in the middle of August because diaries will have been emptier. People had basically been on holiday, but they canned that and headed for Washington. If it had been in a normal working week, they would have had all kinds of other commitments. However, I think it's completely unprecedented. The only something slightly similar I can remember in my days in the Foreign Office in the Kosovo crisis, which at the time felt pretty serious, although it wasn't as serious as this. I think that Tony Blair called a trilateral dinner with Chirac and Schroeder at the time. And one by one, all the other European leaders decided they'd come as well. And again, every half an hour, somebody else declared they were coming. They called it in number 10, the Bring a Bottle Summit. That was sort of, that was European leaders on a European crisis, and it was popping over to London from different European capitals, jumping on your plane and going to the White House. Yeah, completely unprecedented at this scale. But I think they sensed that because Trump is so impulsive, it could be one of those moments where things shifted definitively against Ukrainian and European interests. If Trump had really done another, Oval Office beat up of Zelensky on his own, that could have been catastrophic. And so they reacted very quickly to prevent that. And they've learned that being there, talking to Trump, looking him in the eye, making your arguments as a friend is the only way to have any influence over him.
So go and watch all of them, please, folks, and watch all the other interviews we've done this week. But thank you very much indeed for watching this recap. I'm Philip Ingram. Goodbye.